I'd like to, of course, thank Val and Chris, the TEK team, Gail Woodside, and Dean Salwasser for having this conference, for putting it together. It's an immense amount of time and effort that goes into these things, and I'm really heartened to see this happen. I'd also like to thank Sister Delphine Jackson for her very nice words opening the meeting today. And I want to say just a bit, as I must, about myself and where I am in this scheme of things. First of all, a little disclaimer. I don't come here purporting to talk for any tribe in particular, including those of my own heritage. My dad was mixed Blackfeet. My mother mixed Powhatan Powmonkey band from the Virginias. And I grew up instead of all that in Oklahoma among Pawnees and Otos. So I am a very schizophrenic person today for all of that. But I can't speak for any one of those groups of people. And so anything I'm going to say or share really comes from my own experiences and from the readings and the teachings that others have been kind enough to share. I do want to say one thing. I don't have a PowerPoint of the normal kind. My idea of a PowerPoint is this, so I can work with either hand that way. And I'd like to make some comments that came about conferences like this some years ago when I was living in San Francisco, and as a matter of fact, at UC Berkeley. And at the time, there was an old activist named Rupert Costo, well known. He was a California tribal person, had made a lot of money in the sciences, but remained very staunchly an activist for Indian rights, for the inclusion of natives in every corner of the world, particularly native perspectives in the sciences. So when I was there and getting my start some years ago, and Rupert was in his 80s, I called him up, very brash thing for a guy like me at my age, and said, Rupert, how about having a conference? And he exploded. And it wasn't personal. I mean, it wasn't personally about me or my call. Here's what he said, and it's very simple. He said, no, I'm tired of going to conferences where we get together and we talk and we talk and we talk and we agree to do something, and then everybody goes away and does nothing for a year. And then we come back again and have a conference and talk about why we didn't do anything. He said, I'm not doing any more. Now, I remembered Rupert's words when Val approached me about this, because I had been reading a study that was done here in the College of Forestry in 2005. And it was a study about how to attract more people, more native people, into the sciences, particularly here in the College of Forestry. And it was a fairly thorough questionnaire that was used. What I noticed in the responses that were given was that it seemed those administrators and students who had been questioned almost uniformly felt that we needed to have more native scientists, more native people in the faculty and staff positions. So recruitment was one of the main issues. It was felt among those people interviewed that the only way to do that was to have a point person. Others said, no, that just means we have a token. There was controversy. And at the bottom, the end point was that there should be a group of students as well. Now, often I hear in my work as I go around among the tribal communities, which is the point I didn't mention of my being director of this institute, was to be in contact with the 9 federally recognized tribes in the state of Oregon in particular, and to try to determine what they felt their needs might be from OSU. Instead of OSU responding to an RFP, and because there's grant money, try to find a tribe to hold hostage long enough to get the money in our pocket. Instead, we turned it around some 5 years ago, just about the time this study was being written, and have been working diligently ever since to try to more and more find tribal leaders who are willing to talk with us about their perceived needs that they have for their communities, things that enrich their lives. And then to come here to OSU and try to marry that up, that desire, that need, that enrichment with people here at the university. Does it always work well? Absolutely not. Are we claiming a slowdown due to the economy? Well, of course, it's the thing to do right now. So we're just redoubling our efforts. But one of the things that came out of that study as a bottom line was that we really must have 2 things, as I said: role models in the College of Forestry and elsewhere, frankly, and students, Native students, who then became role models and worked together to bring people into the college. Now, the idea of diversity got mentioned as well. I think that's a very dangerous thing. My background academically was from UC Berkeley, Native American focus within the Ethnic Studies department. And so we talked a lot about diversity. I think diversity is a very dangerous thing to discuss, because I look around the room and I see all the diversity I can handle right here in one room. I don't think we have to go looking for diversity. I believe we are a rather diverse group. I often believe that when we start talking about diversity, we don't really understand what we're talking about. And we are talking about something that is rather elusive in our lexicon. So, in my point of view, using Native American simply to enhance the diversity of any college, university, program isn't what this really needs to be about. We need to think about diversity in terms of the way we approach the world. The world inherently is a diverse place. What we really, I believe, need to think about is how we view the world, not trying to view it as someone else views it, but to understand that there are other views of the world. I say this to my students a lot. Here's the reason. Many students I have in classes, my ethnic studies classes, my Native American law or Native American science and technology classes, come and want to talk about Native points of view and so on and so forth. And the issue, I think, really is that, first of all, many of them who are not Native have indigenous roots. It's from their indigenous roots that a lot of what they think now is science grew. Somehow we managed to separate ourselves to the point where if a Native person comes with science in mind, they often find their ideas seem so foreign to the people who are the gatekeepers of science in institutions, that their ideas are not given even lip service. Their ideas become yet another object, another group of stories to be written up in a book, another group of stories to be told to large gatherings. What we really are focusing on, I believe, here is how to open the doors so that the native scientist who comes from a millennia-old tradition of viewing the same phenomenon under same or similar circumstances in the field over thousands of years, can find acceptance among a group of scientists who have been observing phenomena in laboratories over 5, 10, 20 years. When you come from a tradition that's millennial old, then you come from a place of real foundations. Does that mean that at standing here, I'm trying to offer that suddenly there's a quick fix by including native science in what we do? No, not at all. There's a chance for collaboration. There is a chance, and it is right now, today, just a chance, that we can start to think about another way of seeing the world without asking me to change mine, without asking Frank to change his, without asking anyone to change their point of view, because isn't that the definition of science? Science is only a body of theories, isn't it? I hear a lot of things proposed that are not merely a body of theories. I hear many things proposed as if it's, the saying goes, cast in stone. But what we're really talking about is having omitted an entire body of science from the beginnings of other people coming into the continent and elsewhere around the world, but we're focused on this continent. And then becoming the gatekeepers that shut down and shut out native ways of thinking. We're fortunate that many of the native leadership today are entering schools for advanced degrees because they become able to really see the bigger and better picture, I believe. We look to more people to do that. We're talking about traditional knowledge, which, as far as I can see, is local knowledge. Traditional knowledge, and I heard someone say it just a few minutes ago, traditional knowledge is localized knowledge because it is vetted through being in that place over millennia or from a place similar or having foundations that where the natural world, which includes humans, but that other part of the natural world isn't merely something mysterious and off to the side. It is part and parcel of daily life. Do I hope that somehow our scientists will become natives? No, I don't think that's going to happen, thank goodness. Because then we would lose everybody's perspectives. They would become so cloned that they would be useless to us. What this conference, this meeting, seems to be doing is melding together, hopefully, some different ways of seeing the world. Rupert Costo would not be here today if he were still among us, but I think Rupert would be very happy about that, about this meeting. I'd like to mention a couple of things that are always elusive to me about science and seeing the world in a different way. One of those things comes to me by way of one of our scientists, my dear friend Will Gamble, who recently retired. Will was, for most of his work here at OSU, trying to figure out, with his other colleagues, trying to figure out how it is bears can hibernate for months at a time, and when their time's over in hibernation, stand up and walk away. Now, here's what was always interesting to me about this, because Will and his colleagues from many universities across the globe had gotten together and couldn't come to any sort of understanding about this. And I don't really purport to know myself. I mean, I'm not saying I have some answer, but here's what I did notice about it. Will said, the reason we want to know is we could treat humans better. We could treat their illnesses. Because if a human lies in bed 3 months, we've got a problem. They can't stand up if we leave them, don't turn them, don't exercise them. How is it a bear does that? For all the science that we have, dear Will couldn't come to that understanding. And I'm not sure anybody, but probably the bears, have an understanding of that. There's another story that comes to me. The Niobrara River, which flows across and empties in to the Missouri. Mid-1800s, a wealthy man from St. Louis undertook to write a document about life in the Missouri breaks. And he lived for over 30 years among several tribes of native people. One summer, someone came to him and said they had noticed that the Niobrara River, a substantial river, had gone away, had disappeared. He went and looked, and indeed it was gone. There had been no earthquakes. There had been no explanation, really. And as he traveled around trying to find an explanation, a scientific explanation, he became more frustrated. He rode 150 miles to the nearest military outpost, talked to the people there. No, they hadn't heard anything. Finally, he went to his friends among the tribes, people he had lived with. He spoke their language. He had summered, wintered with them, knew how they joked, knew when they would be pulling his leg, and he asked about the disappearance of the Niobrara. And they did laugh at him, but he knew it was serious. They said, "Why are you so upset? Why are you looking around for some scientific explanation?" He said, "Well, we need to know." They said, "We see this all the time. And we don't worry about it because the river will come back. Right now, the river's upset about what all of you have been doing to it. And it just went away for a while. And we see that, and so we don't become upset about it the way you do." Now, that's a cute story, but it is one that I just saw repeated in a scientific article about the disappearance of a river, not merely going underground. Nothing's suddenly happening that way. Not drying up due to a drought. In the Andes, a river disappeared. It just became bone dry. I don't understand, and frankly, I hope that we don't find out. I think it's much better to learn to live with certain things. That's an aspect of the way we handle science that we're unwilling to face. As my late brother-in-law used to say, "I don't know what's the matter with you guys in that university." said, "What's the matter, Harry?" He was Kiowa, so they were always talking like that. Yeah. "What's the matter, Harry?" He said, "You always want to know why, why?" He said, "Some things just are." In other words, learn to leave some things alone. Learn to let the person who sees the world through different lenses have their way of seeing the world. I should mention, Harry was very proud of being a med tech in the Korean conflict, had scientific training, but he was also the secretary of the Native American Church in Oklahoma for many years. One last thing I'd like to mention is the matter of mountains moving in Northern California. There were long stories, I think, Frank, of mountains moving among the tribal peoples in Northern California. The stories were always uniformly dismissed as stories to entertain children, as were many of the stories that tribal people told. This went on for decades. I think it was about 20 years ago, I noticed that geoscientists in California had come to the understanding that the mountains did actually move. Walk, as the term went. Mountains walked. And the scientists had decided they walked because the plates of the earth shifted. And if you thought of the story about the mountains walking, it covered millennia. And if you thought about the story being told accurately, time after time, in the oral tradition, not the written tradition, not the documents, you know, the things I have to have in my hand to remember what I'm talking about up here, then you saw in the story the mountains walking in Northern California. And suddenly it was an acceptable thing because it had been else. Someone who, at least in my opinion, could benefit a lot from partnerships with Native people. Now we have that going on in this room. We have a TEK team. I'm very pleased to see that. I'm looking forward to the team working with the Collaborative Institute. I'd like to mention that, after all, for people who think about the world the way some do, it is the way nature operates that corroborates science, not the other way around. Frankly, I would hope we get to a point that nature and the way people see the natural world isn't merely seen as corroborating science, and that any longer we quit thinking of science corroborating the natural world. Science corroborating the way people who depend on the natural world, who have lived with it consistently and are inextricably intertwined with it, come together and share their knowledge and their ideas in an open and accepting fashion. A little later, you're going to hear several people talk about beginnings using something that's become popular in our discussion circles, at least here at OSU, the 4 R's. And I can think of a couple of folks who are going to bring those up, so I won't go into the idea of starting from places of respect and ending up with the hope, the mere hope at the end of the 4 R's. As you move through the cycle of them, you end up with the hope of reciprocity, the hope that science, in this case, in my part of the day, that science and those who see the natural world through a different lens come together, sharing openly and equally their ideas, and have reciprocal understanding. The last thing I'd like to mention is the Nazcapi of Labrador. Certainly not about TEK in the Pacific Northwest, nor was my talk really. I refused to give a title, and so poor Val had to. Last thing I'd like to mention is, you know, people say, well, we have to get together to do this. I don't know, or I don't know what to do, or the tradition isn't really part of my being. A fellow named Frank Speck, an anthropologist, spent years living and working among the Nazcapi in a very remote area, an area where hunting was done by family groups, small family groups. People lived so far from each other, they seldom got together as communities. Hardly anything went on that could be said to be community life. What Speck, after years of being there, determined was that there was no religion that he could discern among the Nazcapi. Now, they had lived this way since time began. Speck said, unfortunately, they're so distant from each other and separated, no religion. And then he went on to say something he thought was quite odd, that in each person lived the great man. Each person. And when the person was born, the great man was whole and lived inside. And as the person grew, if the person lied, cheated his neighbor, committed adultery, the great man began to shrink. And finally, if your great man shrunk so far, you couldn't exist any longer. And as I was reading that, I thought, that sounds like the foundations of a whole lot of so-called mainstream religions to me. Don't cheat your neighbor. Don't commit adultery. So on. Don't lie. So it was indeed a thread of religion that I think exists everywhere among all people. And when people say, well, I don't really know how to do this, or I don't know how to act about this, I always think to myself, go inside and think about your great man. I have 2 minutes left now. There is right now a recurrence of something to do with science and traditional work that is haunting the new, or still fairly new, administration in Washington. The head of science and technology, the advisor, the president's advisor, is a man who was very heavily involved a number of years ago. This goes back to 1972, when there was a court case in California. U.S. Forest Service sued, or the Sierra Club sued the U.S. Forest Service because Disney wanted to put a ski resort in the Mineral King Valley. And a lot of old growth trees and other valuable timber resources would be destroyed in the process. The Sierra Club sued the Forest Service. The case never was decided fully because, as with many of these kinds of cases, there was some legislation passed that sort of negated the need to come to a decision. But here's what was interesting about this case. This man who's now head advisor to the president was one of the main architects of a line of thinking widely published, much talked about, and much hated as to whether or not trees, no pun intended, should have standing in court. To have standing in court, you need to be able to be in court and be represented at least. And the argument has always been, because I'm going to wrap this up with a money talk, the argument has always been, well, the trees couldn't have standing in court, even though they were a valuable resource for a number of reasons, economically and so forth, because they weren't human. They weren't real people. For a number of native folks, thinking of trees or the water or the rocks, the animals other than human animals, as not having will and volition is antithetical to thinking about the world at all. So here's a guy proposing that trees should have standing in court, and the argument is they can't. They're not human. Well, so besides that other point of view about what trees are, someone has pointed out there's a whole lot of entities that aren't human that can go to court. Corporations can go to court. There's all kinds of municipal and state agencies that can go to court. It takes having someone who can act on behalf of the trees. Now that argument has sprung up again. I'll leave it to you to search it out on Google or Wikipedia or wherever it may be now. It's far more convoluted than I can make it. My point is, we are used to thinking about things in court because we deal with Anglo-Saxon tradition court systems, not native court systems in the main. Those occur in our own communities. We end up dealing with Anglo-Saxon-based court systems, which require a remedy really in money. That's really what it's about. So we need to move away from that and to come mercifully to an end for you. I got an email from one of my Kiowa friends. No, they're not from Oregon, they're from Oklahoma. He said, what are you doing? So I told him, I said, well, I'm about to go over and spout off to this group tomorrow. So he said, I'm sending you something. Here's what he sent me. It's just a short little email. Only after the last tree has been cut down, only after the last river has been poisoned, only after the last fish has been caught, only then will you find that money can't be eaten. He's not a scientist, obviously.